Okay, what is up there, YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video on some rare homemade and modification tanks that were used by the North Vietnamese Army during the Vietnam War of 1964 through 1975. During the Vietnam War, the North Vietnamese Army lacked a large number of anti-aircraft weapon systems. Now, they did import some anti-aircraft artillery systems from both China and the Soviet Union, and most of these were either World War II vintage or early Cold War artillery systems, like the Soviet KS-19, for example, which was a 100mm anti-aircraft artillery gun. Later on, they did receive some anti-aircraft missiles, namely the S-75 Davina and S-125 Neva, which were delivered from both China and the Soviet Union. But one of the rarest class of tanks used by the North Vietnamese Army were anti-aircraft tanks, or self-propelled anti-aircraft systems. And these were improvised anti-aircraft platforms that were built on the chassis of mostly World War II vintage tanks like the old Soviet T-34 and some early Cold War vehicles like the Russian BTR-40. So let's go over some of the rare Vietnamese anti-aircraft tanks, or improvised tanks, of the Vietnam War. And the first tank on the list is the Type 63. The Type 63 is a self-propelled anti-aircraft medium tank that was developed between 1962 and 1963. The tank was actually developed in China, and at least a handful made it to Vietnam. The North Vietnamese would later reverse engineer this tank using some of the T-34 tanks purchased from the Soviet Union or China in the years before the Vietnam War between North Vietnam and the United States, along with the US's allies South Vietnam, also known as the ARVN forces. The Type 63, also known as the Type 65, had a main armament of one twin 37mm Type 61 anti-aircraft autocannon, which was a Chinese copy of a Soviet World War II era autocannon, also known as the K1, or the model 1939 37mm Soviet anti-aircraft artillery system. The secondary armament was one 7.62mm machine gun in the chassis. The vehicle was pretty much just a rebuilt T-34 as an anti-aircraft platform. It had the same weight of 32 tons and the same armor thickness of just 18 to 45 millimeters of armor. The speed of the vehicle was 55 kilometers per hour, or 34 miles per hour, and only about a dozen of these were made or constructed and used by the North Vietnamese Army starting in 1966 and 1967. The anti-aircraft capability of this tank was pretty limited, as the Type 61 was pretty much just a Chinese copy of a World War II era Soviet anti-aircraft gun. It was only useful against slow-flying reconnaissance planes and some slow-flying ground attack aircraft, like the American A-1 Sky Raider, for example. It was pretty useless against high-speed jet aircraft like the American F-4 Bantam and the F-105 Thunder Chief, which were some of the fastest planes used by the American forces during the Vietnam War, and were used as air support for the South Vietnamese ARVN forces. So the Type 63/Type 65 was only useful against low-flying aircraft. It could also be used against helicopters, mostly gunships, and helicopter cargo ships or transport helicopters being used by the U.S. forces. But outside of that, it was kind of useless against anything faster than a piston-powered plane. Only about 12 of these were used, and they were used all the way up until the end of the conflict. One of these Type 63/Type 65 tanks was captured by the U.S. and South Vietnamese ARVN forces in 1970 and can actually be seen today at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in the United States, and is also the sole surviving example of the Type 63 outside of China and Vietnam. Another T-34 modification was the Type 65-57, and this was a T-34 fitted with a Soviet-made 57mm AZP-60 S-60 anti-aircraft autocannon, which was a beefed-up 57mm anti-aircraft gun that was used from the 1950s onward, and is still in service today with a variety of different countries that were client states of the Soviet Union and are now still client states of modern-day Russia. In fact, the S-60 57mm anti-aircraft gun is also still used by the Vietnamese air defense units even to this very day. But in the 1960s, the Vietnamese created a secondary variant of the Type 63 known as the Type 65-57. It was pretty much just a Type 63-65 but with a 57mm gun instead of the 37mm anti-aircraft autocannon. Only a small number of these were made, and only one photo survives of this vehicle. There is no surviving example of the Type 65-57 anywhere in the world. Now, in the 1950s, North Vietnam also received some Soviet-made Su-76, and these were World War II vintage tank destroyers that were made in the middle of the Second World War, around 1943 and 1944. In 1965-1966, the Vietnamese were running out of spare parts for these tanks, and some of these chassis were rebuilt into improvised anti-aircraft artillery systems, and these were known as the Su-76-37 and the Su-76-23, and these were pretty much the Su-76 chassis rebuilt with a 37mm Type 61 anti-aircraft autocannon or a 23mm Zu-23-2 anti-aircraft autocannon, plus one 7.62mm machine gun. So it's pretty much like the Type 63 and the Type 65-57, but with a 37mm and 23mm gun. Only a small number of these were made around the same time as the other two vehicles on this list, and they were used all the way up until the end of the Vietnam War between North Vietnam and the US-backed forces. What happened to them after 1974-1975 is unknown, but no example of these vehicles survived to this day. The weight of these vehicles were 11.5 tons, and they had an armor thickness of 15 to 35 millimeters. The speed was 45 kilometers per hour, or 28 miles per hour, and only about a dozen or so of these vehicles were made. Now, the Soviets supplied Vietnam with about 30 to 40 of those Su-76 tank destroyers, so at least about one-third of them were converted into either Su-76-37s or Su-76-23s throughout the course of the Vietnam War. And finally, in terms of combat vehicles, here is one of the rarest Vietnamese-made improvised anti-aircraft systems, and this is the BTR-40 K13 self-propelled anti-aircraft system. And this was a BTR-40 that was rebuilt into a mobile anti-aircraft missile launcher. The vehicle was fitted with one Vimple K-13 infrared homing air-to-air anti-aircraft missile. And this was a missile system that was developed for the MiG-17, the MiG-19, and MiG-21 series of Soviet jet aircraft, or jet fighter aircraft. The missile had a speed of Mach 2.5, so it could keep up with just about any American warplane being used in the Vietnam War. Now, keep in mind, the Vietnamese did receive some anti-aircraft missiles later on, but in the early 1960s, they had very few anti-aircraft missile batteries. In fact, the situation was so bad for North Vietnam that they were purchasing old World War II vintage anti-aircraft artillery systems, like the German 88mm flak. A few dozen, or at least about a dozen or so, World War II vintage 88mm Flak 18s and Flak 41s actually served in the North Vietnamese anti-aircraft artillery units. So in 1964, the North Vietnamese began rebuilding some of their BTR-40s into anti-aircraft missile batteries. And this here is one example. The weight of these vehicles were 5.3 tons. They had an armor thickness of 6 to 8 millimeters and a speed of 80 kilometers per hour or 50 miles per hour. Only about a dozen of these were used by the North Vietnamese forces during the early part of the war in Vietnam between North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and South Vietnam's ally, the United States. Now, this missile system, the Vimple K13, was a short-range missile, so it could only hit targets at about 1 or 2 miles distance. Beyond 2 miles, it was pretty useless, so it was only good for intercepting low-flying jet aircraft or slow-flying early or late piston aircraft that were still being used by the US-backed forces. After 1965, the North Vietnamese began receiving some more advanced anti-aircraft missile systems like the aforementioned S-75 and S-125 missile batteries, but at least a handful were still used all the way up until the end of the conflict. And that brings us to the rarest vehicle on the list, and that is a Vietnamese modification of a Soviet T-34 into a demining vehicle. Not just any kind of demining vehicle, an acoustic demining vehicle. This was a vehicle that used sound waves to either detonate or disarm landmines, mostly anti-personnel landmines. It was pretty useless against anti-tank mines, as anti-tank mines were much larger and were sound resistant. They could only be triggered by a certain amount of weight, usually the weight of a heavy armored fighting vehicle. But this system here was used at least for a short period of time until the Vietnamese got their hands on more modern Soviet and Chinese-made demining systems. But for a short period of time, the Vietnamese did convert many old World War II vintage T-34 tanks into acoustic demining vehicles that use sound waves to disarm or detonate landmines, mostly anti-personnel landmines, and some of the early anti-tank mines, the light anti-tank mines. It was pretty useless against medium and heavy anti-tank mines, as those could only be detonated via the weight of a heavy armored fighting vehicle. And there you have it. These were some of the rare tanks and tank modifications developed by the North Vietnamese Army, mostly as anti-aircraft weapon systems during the early part of the Vietnam War. Although some of these were still used all the way up until the end of the war between North Vietnam and the United States. So which of these were your favorite? If I had to choose, mine would be the BTR-40 K13 anti-aircraft missile system, because it is a wheeled vehicle, and unlike the T-34, it is pretty light and would be pretty easy to manufacture or, modify if I were the North Vietnamese. So which of these were your favorite? Please tell me in the comment section below, and until next time, this was J-Man Time, signing off.